My brother-in-law leaned back in his chair, pointed his beer bottle at me, and laughed. So what? You served coffee on base, right? The room chuckled. I set my glass down. 30 seconds later, his retired Marine Colonel father looked him dead in the eye and quietly said, "Boy, apologize now. My name is Rebecca Lawson, and until that Thanksgiving, I had spent almost 15 years making sure people underestimated me. If you'd passed me in the grocery store, you wouldn't have looked twice." I was 38 years old, lived in Virginia Beach with my husband Ethan, drove a 5-year-old Subaru Outback that always seemed to need another oil change, and worked as an aviation safety consultant for a private contractor near Naval Air Station Oceana. Nothing about my life screamed interesting. Honestly, I preferred it that way. That Thanksgiving fell on a cold Thursday in late November. Ethan and I left Virginia Beach just after 8 in the morning, with a pumpkin pie balanced carefully in the back seat, and my homemade green bean casserole riding on my lap, because Ethan insisted the roads around Richmond were full of potholes big enough to swallow a Buick. Rassle. By the time we pulled into his parents' driveway, a little after 11, every parking spot was taken. His younger brother Tyler had arrived before us. That wasn't surprising. Tyler liked being first. He also liked being the loudest person in any room. As soon as we stepped inside, I heard him before I saw him. I'm telling you, if people worked half as hard as I do, they would stop making excuses. His voice carried through the house like a radio turned up too high. Linda, my mother-in-law, hugged me tightly. "I'm so glad you're here. Wouldn't miss it." She took the casserole dish from my hands. Frank Miller, Colonel Frank Miller, United States Marine Corps retired, walked out from the kitchen, drying his hands on a towel. He gave me one of his quiet smiles. "Rebecca, good to see you, Colonel. I've told you for years to call me Frank." "I know. You still won't." "No, sir." He laughed softly. Frank had always been different from the rest of the family. He listened more than he talked. He never bragged about Vietnam or Desert Storm or his decades in uniform. If someone else brought it up, he'd answer politely and move on. I respected that, maybe because I understood it. Most people imagine veterans spend every conversation talking about their service. The ones I respected usually did the opposite. Dinner started around 1 p.m. Turkey, ham, sweet potatoes with toasted marshmallows, homemade rolls, enough pie to feed half of Richmond. Tyler was sitting across from me. His wife Melissa sat beside him, scrolling through her phone whenever he launched into another story about work. He sold medical equipment. Every holiday somehow became a speech about his latest commission. Halfway through dinner, he noticed the small Navy veteran pin on my sweater. "I forgot you were Navy." I nodded. "Yep. What did you do again?" "Oh, a little of this and that." He laughed. "No, seriously, I flew." His eyebrows lifted. "I thought women mostly handled support jobs." Linda shot him a look. "Tyler, what I'm asking?" I shrugged. "I was an aviator." "Really, really?" He grinned like he'd already decided I was exaggerating. "So, what you served coffee on base, right?" A couple cousins laughed. Melissa looked embarrassed. Ethan stopped cutting his turkey. I reached for my water glass, took one slow sip, then placed it carefully back on the table. "Try again." Tyler leaned back. "Oh, come on, I'm serious." "So, what did you actually do?" "I flew." "No," he smirked. "What was your real job?" I could feel every pair of eyes drifting toward us. Family gatherings always seem to do that. One loud voice pulls everyone into a conversation they weren't planning to join. He chuckled again. "Then what did you do in the Navy?" I answered, exactly the way I'd answered questions for years, calmly, without raising my voice. I was a TOPGUN instructor. The room went completely silent. Not movie silence, real silence. Forks stopped moving. Someone set down a spoon. Even the football game playing in the living room suddenly sounded louder. Tyler burst out laughing. "Oh, that's a good one." Nobody joined him. I wasn't looking at Tyler anymore. I was looking at Frank. His expression had changed in a way I'd never seen before. Not anger, recognition. He slowly folded his napkin, looked directly at his son, then spoke in the calmest voice imaginable. "Boy." Tyler kept smiling. "Apologize." "Dad, she's kidding." Frank didn't blink. Now, the smile disappeared from Tyler's face. "What? You heard me." "Dad," I said, "apologize." Nobody moved. Linda looked back and forth between them. Melissa quietly whispered, "Tyler." He laughed nervously. "Seriously?" Frank looked at me. Rebecca, sir, I have one question. Okay, were you ever assigned to Fallon? I held his gaze. Yes, sir, he nodded once. That was all, no dramatic reaction, no speech, just one slow nod. Then he looked back at Tyler. You have absolutely no idea who you're talking to. Tyler frowned. Dad, she can't seriously expect us to believe Frank interrupted him. I said apologize. For the first time since I'd known Tyler, he looked genuinely unsure of himself. He glanced around the table hoping someone would rescue him. Nobody did. Instead, every eye slowly turned toward me. I suddenly wished they hadn't, because this was exactly why I almost never talked about my years in the Navy. Not because I wasn't proud, because once people knew, they stopped seeing the person sitting in front of them. Everything changed, and somehow I had this sinking feeling this dinner was only the beginning. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Tyler looked around the table as if he were waiting for someone to laugh with him again. Nobody did. He forced a grin. Dad, seriously, you're acting like she's some kind of war hero. Frank calmly reached for his iced tea. I didn't say that. Then what are you talking about? Frank looked at me instead of answering. I think Rebecca deserves to enjoy Thanksgiving without having to defend herself. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. I smiled politely. It's all right. No, Frank said quietly. It isn't. Tyler threw up his hands. Oh, come on, she says she was a Top Gun instructor, like that's supposed to impress everybody. I didn't say it to impress anyone, I replied. You kind of did. No. You could have just said you were a pilot, you asked. I asked because I figured there was an actual answer. Ethan finally spoke, there was. You. Tyler rolled his eyes. Oh, please. Melissa nudged her husband under the table. Enough. I'm just saying. Linda stood up and started gathering empty plates. Who's ready for pie? Everyone understood what she was trying to do. Change the subject. Normally it would have worked. Not this time. Tyler leaned toward me again. So, what did you teach? Which button starts the coffee machine? Melissa closed her eyes. Oh my gosh. I let out a slow breath. Not because his joke bothered me, because I knew exactly where this kind of conversation usually ended. Someone demanded proof. Someone else accused me of lying. Then I either embarrassed everyone by answering questions they didn't understand, or I stayed quiet and let people think whatever they wanted. I'd chosen silence for years. It had made life easier, at least until today. Frank placed his fork on the table. Tyler, what if you had any idea what you're talking about? You wouldn't have made that joke. Then explain it. Frank shook his head. It's not my story. He looked at me again. You don't owe anyone an explanation. I gave him a grateful nod. Thank you. Tyler leaned back with a laugh. Convenient. Nobody answered him. The conversation finally drifted toward football, grandchildren, and Christmas shopping. But the warmth that usually filled Thanksgiving dinner never really came back. Something had shifted. Not because I'd revealed anything extraordinary, because people suddenly realized they didn't actually know me. Around 4 that afternoon, Ethan and I stepped outside to help carry folding tables into the garage. Cold air always feels different after you've spent hours inside a crowded house. Fresh. Gad quiet. For about 5 minutes, neither of us said anything. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. You okay? I've had worse Thanksgivings. Gad, he smiled. God, I believe that. God, I just hate making everything awkward. Guy, you didn't. Guy kind of did. Guy, no. He stopped beside the garage. Tyler did. I leaned against the Subaru. You know what's funny? Guy, what? God, I spent almost 12 years trying not to stand out. And the one time I answer a simple question honestly, everyone thinks you're making it up. We both laughed. Not because it was hilarious, because it was absurd. Frank found me a few minutes later. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one. Got still take it black? God, I do. God, I remembered. We stood quietly in the driveway watching leaves blow across the street. Finally, he spoke. God, I owe you an apology. Guy, you don't? God, I invited my family. Guy, so did Ethan. God, they embarrassed you. God, they embarrassed themselves. God, that made him smile. I suppose that's true. He looked down into his coffee. I recognized Fallon immediately. So I noticed. I spent several weeks there years ago during joint exercises. I nodded. I remember Marines coming through. I wasn't assigned there permanently, I figured. He looked at me carefully. I also recognized your call sign. I blinked. You remember that? I do. I hadn't heard anyone say that call sign in years. Not since I left active duty. For a second, I wasn't standing in suburban Richmond anymore. I was back in Nevada. Dry heat, jet fuel, dust blowing across the runway, the constant sound of engines, the endless rhythm of briefings, debriefings, simulations, and flights. Frank smiled faintly. You probably don't remember me. I remember more faces than names. You were giving a lecture. I gave hundreds. You talked about decision-making. That surprised me. Not because I'd forgotten, because somebody else remembered. I wasn't even teaching Marines. No. But they invited observers. He laughed softly. I walked out thinking I'd just watched one of the best instructors I'd ever seen. I stared into my coffee. That was a long time ago. It was. I don't really think about it anymore. I figured. He hesitated before asking another question. Why have you never told the family? I answered honestly. Because every time people hear Top Gun, they stop listening. He nodded. They picture the movie. Exactly. Then, they either think you're lying, or they treat you like a celebrity. And you wanted neither. No. I looked down the quiet street. I wanted to be Rebecca. Joelle. That evening, Ethan and I drove back toward Virginia Beach. The highway was unusually clear. Christmas lights had already begun appearing on front porches. The radio played old Eagles songs while Ethan drove. About halfway home, my phone buzzed. Then, buzzed again. Then again. I think something's wrong, Ethan said. I opened Facebook. The first thing I saw was Tyler's newest post, a picture he'd secretly taken during dinner, me sitting at the table with my water glass. Across the top he'd written, "Family Thanksgiving just got hilarious. My sister-in-law claimed she was a Top Gun instructor. Guess next year she'll tell us she trained astronauts too." A laughing emoji. 3 more underneath. The comments were already piling up. Some people never stop making stuff up. Sounds like stolen valor. Everybody knows women didn't do that. What a joke. Someone had already shared it. Then another. By the time we reached Williamsburg, the post had been shared over 80 times. I locked my phone and stared out the passenger window. The lights from passing cars blurred together. Ethan reached over and squeezed my hand. You don't have to deal with this tonight. I know. But deep down, I also knew Tyler wasn't finished. And for the first time in years, staying silent suddenly felt a lot harder than speaking up. I thought sleeping on it would help. It didn't. When I woke up Friday morning at 6:30, the first thing I saw wasn't the sunrise over our neighborhood in Virginia Beach. It was the glow of my phone on the nightstand. 23 missed notifications. I already knew why. Ethan was still asleep beside me, so I slipped out of bed, pulled on a sweatshirt, and walked downstairs. Our Labrador Daisy stretched, wagged her tail, and followed me into the kitchen. I started the coffee maker out of habit. Some routines are comforting even when nothing else is. While the coffee brewed, I opened Facebook. Tyler's post had exploded overnight. Nearly 3,000 shares, hundreds of comments. Some people thought it was funny. Others were downright cruel. Everybody lies on Thanksgiving. Another fake veteran looking for attention. She probably worked in the cafeteria. One comment bothered me more than the rest. Real military people don't have to brag. I stared at that sentence for a long time. The strange part was I agreed with it. The problem was I hadn't bragged. I'd answered a question. One sentence. That was all. The coffee machine beeped. I poured myself a mug and tried to ignore the knot growing in my stomach. By 8:00 my phone rang. It was my manager. His name was Greg. He'd hired me 3 years earlier because of my aviation background. Normally, he called only on Mondays. "Morning, Rebecca." "Morning." There was an awkward pause. "I hate to ask this." "Ask." "We've gotten a couple emails." I closed my eyes. I figured. "They're saying you fabricated your military experience." "I didn't. I know." His voice was calm. "But our clients are asking questions." "I understand. You don't have to explain anything classified." "I'm not allowed to." "I know that too." He sighed. "I just wanted you to hear it from me before rumors spread any further." "I appreciate that." "We're behind you." That sentence helped more than he probably realized. After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table for several minutes. I wasn't angry, not yet. Mostly I felt tired. I'd spent over a decade protecting information that wasn't mine to share. Now that silence was being mistaken for dishonesty. By Saturday afternoon, the story had drifted beyond Facebook. Someone copied Tyler's post onto a local veterans discussion page. Then another. Soon strangers were arguing with complete confidence about a woman they'd never met. One retired Navy chief wrote, "If she's telling the truth, people ought to leave her alone." Another replied, "Nobody becomes a Top Gun instructor without proof." Someone else posted a clip from the movie Top Gun. That one collected hundreds of laughing reactions. The internet has a strange way of making complete strangers feel like lifelong experts. I tried ignoring it. Really, I did. Instead, I walked Daisy along the boardwalk, near the ocean. The December wind was sharp enough to sting my face. Families pushed strollers, older couples held hands, fishermen stood quietly on the pier. Nobody there knew anything about Facebook. It was peaceful. For almost an hour, I convinced myself the whole thing didn't matter. Then my phone buzzed again. "Melissa, hi, I'm so sorry, it isn't your fault. I told Tyler to delete the post, and he said everyone deserves a laugh." I wasn't surprised. He doesn't understand what he's doing. I know. She hesitated. "I don't think he realizes people actually believe him. They do." I'm embarrassed. "You don't have to apologize for him. I wish he'd listen." "So do I." After we hung up, I looked out across the Atlantic. The waves kept coming, completely indifferent to Facebook. Sometimes nature is a good reminder that our biggest problems aren't actually very big. Unfortunately, human beings don't always work that way. Monday afternoon, there was a knock at our front door. When I opened it, Frank stood there holding a paper grocery bag. "I was in Virginia Beach. You drove 2 hours, I've made longer trips." He stepped inside. "I brought apple cider donuts." I laughed. "That's one way to get invited in." He smiled. "I thought so." We sat on the back porch while Daisy rested at our feet. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. Football, the weather, his tomato garden. Finally, he leaned forward. "I need to tell you something. I'm listening." I checked. I frowned. "Checked what?" "Your service record." I stared at him. "You what?" I didn't pry. He shook his head. "I used the same public verification available to any veteran." "Oh." I wanted to make absolutely certain before I said another word to Tyler. And he looked almost offended. And exactly what I expected. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he said something that stayed with me. "You know why I recognized your call sign?" I assumed it was coincidence. It wasn't. He looked toward the yard. Years ago, during a joint training conference, I heard Marine pilots talking. I waited. They weren't talking about themselves. They were talking about an instructor who never raised her voice. A faint smile crossed my face. I remember that. They said she could point out mistakes nobody else noticed. I looked away. I wasn't perfect. "No," he nodded. "That's exactly what they admired." I felt unexpectedly emotional. Not because he was praising me. Because those years had felt so distant. Like another lifetime. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" "A program." I unfolded it. "Veterans Day Community Honor Banquet, hosted by the Richmond Veterans Alliance. Master of Ceremonies, Tyler Miller." I looked up. "He's hosting. He volunteered months ago." I almost laughed. The irony. It gets better. Frank's eyes twinkled. "He plans to give a speech about honoring veterans." I shook my head slowly. "You can't make this up." "I've already spoken with the event committee." That caught my attention. "You what?" "They invited me to say a few words." I looked at him carefully. "What are you planning?" "I'm planning to tell the truth. I don't want a spectacle." "Neither do I. I don't want him humiliated." Frank gave me a long look. "Rebecca." "Yes." "There's a difference between humiliating someone," he paused, "and allowing them to face the consequences of their own choices." I couldn't argue with that. Because deep down, I'd been wrestling with exactly that question. Part of me wanted Tyler to feel what I had felt. The embarrassment, the doubt, the frustration of having strangers decide who you were. Another part of me hated the idea of public revenge. That wasn't who I'd spent my life trying to become. Frank seemed to read my thoughts. "You don't have to say a word. I don't know." "What do I do?" He smiled. "You show up. And then? Let him introduce himself." For the first time since Thanksgiving, I smiled without forcing it because I realized something. I didn't need to prove who I was. Tyler was about to prove exactly who he was. Veterans Day arrived on a bright Tuesday, with the kind of crisp November air that makes every American flag seem to snap a little harder in the wind. By 9 that morning, I had already decided I wasn't going. Then I changed my mind. Then I changed it again. Ethan found me standing in our bedroom, staring into the closet. You've been looking at the same 3 jackets for 10 minutes. I know. Still thinking about staying home? I nodded. This isn't my kind of thing. I know. I hate public attention. I know. He smiled. I've been married to you for 12 years. I laughed despite myself. What if this turns into a circus? It might. What if people think I'm trying to embarrass Tyler? Ethan walked over and took both my hands. Rebecca, you didn't create this. I looked down. He did. That was the sentence I needed to hear. Not because it erased my doubts, because it reminded me where they belonged. The Richmond Veterans Alliance banquet was held at the American Legion Hall, just outside downtown Richmond. I'd been there once years before for a charity fundraiser. It wasn't fancy. Brick building, large meeting room, long tables covered with white cloths, American flags in every corner. Photos of local veterans lined the walls. Coffee brewing in giant stainless steel urns, homemade desserts donated by volunteers. It felt exactly like hundreds of community events I'd attended over the years. Real people, real service, no Hollywood. By 6 nearly 300 people had filled the hall. Veterans from Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Their spouses, children, grandchildren. Several local reporters stood near the entrance interviewing guests. I kept my head down. Frank had reserved seats near the back, exactly where I wanted to be. The Tyler hadn't noticed us yet. He was too busy shaking hands, laughing, walking from table to table with a wireless microphone clipped to his jacket. He looked completely comfortable, almost proud. Melissa spoke first. Her shoulders relaxed. She quietly slipped over. I'm glad you came. I almost didn't. I'm glad you changed your mind. She hesitated. He still doesn't think he did anything wrong. I sighed. I figured. He thinks everyone's forgotten about Facebook. I looked across the room at Tyler. No, they haven't. The program began with the Pledge of Allegiance. Then a high school choir sang the national anthem. An honor guard presented the colors. The room stood in respectful silence. Everything felt sincere, exactly as it should. Tyler walked onto the stage wearing a dark blue suit. He smiled into the microphone. Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're here to honor the brave men and women who've served this great country. Applause filled the room. Dency, he continued confidently. We should always respect our veterans because sacrifice deserves gratitude. I looked down at my hands. The irony wasn't funny anymore. It was sad. He spent nearly 10 minutes talking about integrity, character, honor. The words sounded polished, but every sentence reminded me of that Thanksgiving dinner. Then halfway through his speech, his eyes found me. For just a second, surprise flashed across his face. Then he smiled. There are even a few family members here tonight. Several people turned toward our table. Tyler chuckled. I suppose military stories are always a little bigger around Thanksgiving. A handful of uneasy laughs drifted through the room. I felt Ethan tense beside me. I gently touched his arm. It's okay. Tyler kept going. You know how families are. This time, nobody laughed, not even politely. He seemed to notice. His smile faded slightly. He cleared his throat. And now I'd like to invite my father, retired Marine Colonel Frank Miller, to share a few remarks. Frank walked to the podium without any notes. No dramatic music. No theatrical pause. Just the slow, steady walk of a man who had spent decades speaking only when he had something worth saying. Good evening. His voice carried easily across the room. I'll keep this brief. He smiled. My wife says that's the first miracle you'll witness tonight. The audience laughed warmly. Even I smiled. Frank knew exactly how to put people at ease. He spent several minutes thanking volunteers and recognizing local veterans by name. Then his tone changed. There is something personal I need to address. The room became still. At Thanksgiving, someone in my family made unfair assumptions about another veteran. No names, no accusations, just facts. They questioned her service without knowing the first thing about it. I felt every heartbeat. Frank continued. I served in the Marine Corps for 33 years. He paused. I learned something important. He looked slowly around the room. The loudest voice isn't usually the most experienced. Silence. I verified the facts before speaking tonight. He carefully chose every word. I will not discuss classified assignments. I will not discuss operational details. But I can tell you this. He looked toward my table. Rebecca Lawson served honorably. She earned qualifications that very few aviators ever achieve, and she later instructed pilots, entrusted with some of the most demanding responsibilities in naval aviation. He smiled slightly. Me. I know what those words mean. So do many people sitting in this room. For a second, nothing happened. Then a man near the front stood up. Gray hair, navy blazer, gold pilot wings pinned above the pocket. He looked directly at me. I knew that call sign. Another veteran stood. So did I, then another. Within moments, half a dozen retired aviators had turned toward me. One older captain walked all the way across the room. He stopped beside my chair, extended his hand. It's been a long time, ma'am. I recognized him almost immediately. Tom? He laughed. I was hoping you'd remember. You still owe me a perfect landing. The room burst into genuine laughter. Tom turned toward the audience. I flew with students she trained. He shook his head with admiration. You don't forget instructors like that. Applause began quietly, then spread. More people stood. Soon the entire room was on its feet. Not cheering wildly, not shouting, just honest, heartfelt applause. The kind that means something. I felt my face grow warm. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I simply stood and nodded. Nothing more. Across the stage, Tyler looked as though the floor had vanished beneath him. One reporter quietly walked over and asked him a question. Another held up a phone displaying the Facebook post. He didn't answer. Melissa lowered her head. Steve Frank stepped away from the microphone. His job was finished. He hadn't attacked his son. He hadn't humiliated him. He had simply replaced a lie with the truth. Sometimes that hurts far more. Tyler slowly removed the microphone from his jacket without saying another word. He walked off the stage through a side door and disappeared into the hallway. No one followed him. For the first time since Thanksgiving, the room wasn't looking at me because of a rumor. They were looking at me because the truth had finally caught up. The banquet ended a little after 8 lean. People gathered in small circles around the coffee tables, catching up with old friends and swapping stories that only veterans seemed able to tell. There wasn't much talk about me anymore, and I was grateful for that. A few people came over to shake my hand. One retired Navy commander thanked me for my years of service. A Vietnam veteran told me he appreciated the way I'd handled myself. You never tried to make it about you, he said. I didn't want it to be. I could tell. That meant more to me than the standing ovation ever could. Recognition fades. Respect lasts. Tyler never came back into the banquet hall. Melissa found me just before Ethan and I left. I'm sorry. You've already apologized. I know. She looked exhausted. I just wanted you to know this isn't who I thought I'd married. I wasn't sure how to answer. People are complicated. One terrible decision doesn't erase every good thing they've ever done, but it also doesn't erase the damage. I hope he figures that out, I finally said. So do I. She hugged me before walking away. The drive back to Virginia Beach felt different from the drive home after Thanksgiving. That night I'd stared out the window, wondering whether silence had been a mistake. Tonight, Ethan and I mostly enjoyed the quiet. About halfway home he glanced over at me. You okay? I think so, you don't sound convinced. I smiled. I'm relieved. But I don't like seeing family fall apart. He nodded. I know. I never wanted Tyler humiliated. He humiliated himself. I know. He reached over and squeezed my hand. You gave him every chance. I thought about Thanksgiving. Frank had asked him to apologize. Melissa had asked him to stop. I had stayed quiet. Instead of letting it go, Tyler had taken it online. Every step after that had been his own choice. That realization finally lifted something I'd been carrying for weeks. 3 days later, Tyler's Facebook page disappeared. At first, I assumed he'd simply made it private. Then Melissa texted Ethan. He had deleted every post connected to Thanksgiving, every joke, every meme, every comment. The apology came a week later, not online, not through a lawyer, not through Frank. He showed up at our front door on a rainy Saturday morning. I almost didn't answer. When I opened the door, he stood there alone holding nothing but a folded umbrella. He looked older somehow. Not physically, just tired. Can we talk? I stepped aside. Come in. Ethan stayed in the kitchen while Tyler and I sat at the dining room table. For almost a full minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, Tyler looked down at his hands. I've practiced this speech 100 times. You don't need a speech, he nodded. I know. Another silence. Then he took a deep breath. I was wrong. I waited. I thought you were exaggerating. I wasn't. I know that now. His voice cracked slightly. I also thought making jokes would make people laugh. They did. Yeah. He rubbed his forehead. Until they didn't. I didn't rescue him from the silence. Some moments deserve to breathe. I've spent my whole life trying to be the smartest person in every room. He gave a sad little laugh. Turns out I wasn't even close. I could hear rain tapping softly against the windows. Tyler looked at me. I embarrassed. You did. I hurt your reputation. You tried. He nodded. I deserve that. Then he said the one sentence I hadn't expected. I embarrassed my father. I thought about Frank standing calmly at that podium. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted his son. He'd simply chosen honesty over loyalty to a bad decision. I think that's what bothers me the most, Tyler admitted. He looked disappointed. He was. I've never seen that expression before. No parent wants to. His eyes filled with tears. I wish I could take it back. I believe you. You do? I do. He looked surprised. I don't think you're an evil person, Tyler. I'm not sure I believe that this week. I think you got caught up in being right. I always have to be. You don't. That sentence hung in the room for several seconds. Finally, I smiled. I'm willing to move forward. You are? Yes, but he nodded before I finished. I have to earn back trust. You do. I understand. We stood. For a second, it felt awkward. Then he held out his hand. Instead, I hugged him. Not because he'd earned forgiveness in one conversation. Because everyone deserves the chance to become better than their worst mistake. Life slowly returned to normal. Christmas came, then New Year's. Frank called more often than he used to. Sometimes we'd spend an hour talking about airplanes. Sometimes we'd spend an hour talking about absolutely nothing important. Both conversations were equally enjoyable. Tyler changed too, not overnight. Real change never happens overnight. He became quieter, more willing to listen, less interested in being the center of attention. Months later, during another family dinner, someone asked me about flying. Before I could answer, Tyler smiled. If Rebecca wants to tell the story, she'll tell it. Then he changed the subject. That small moment told me more than any apology ever could. He had learned. Looking back now, I realized my revenge wasn't exposing Tyler. It wasn't proving I had been telling the truth. It wasn't hearing strangers applaud. The real victory was refusing to let someone else's opinion define my own worth. For years, I'd believed staying silent was always the stronger choice. Sometimes it is, but sometimes allowing the truth to stand on its own is just as important. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Never assume you know someone's life because of a title, a uniform, or a first impression. The quietest person in the room may have walked a road you'll never fully understand. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story reminded you of someone who earned respect without asking for it, I'd love to hear about them. Until next time, take good care of yourself, and don't be too quick to judge the people who choose humility over attention. The gloves hit the pavement an inch from my sneakers, and the whole street went quiet enough to hear the ice cracking in someone's lemonade. 22 years old black belt, undefeated in 3 amateur cages. And he was smiling at me like I was already on the ground. He had a phone out. He had an audience. What he didn't have was any idea that I'd spent the last 2 decades training men twice his size to survive things he couldn't spell. I looked down at those gloves, then back up at him, and I asked the only question that mattered. Are you sure? My name is Ashley Parker. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my adult life, the only people who knew my rank called me Colonel, and meant it with their whole chest. But on Larkspur Lane, in the quiet manicured cul-de-sacs of Cedar Ridge, Colorado, I was just the woman at the end of the street who mowed her own lawn and drove a Ford F-150 with a dent in the tailgate that I never bothered to fix. I moved there in June after my son Ethan finished 9th grade, looking for exactly what the real estate listing promised: peace. 20 years in the Army will do that to you. It teaches you to crave quiet the way other people crave excitement. I'd commanded soldiers in the 75th Ranger Regiment, led night operations where the margin for error was the width of a heartbeat, and briefed generals who didn't blink when I corrected them. But none of that mattered here. Here I was just Ashley, a single mother, a woman who kept to herself, who waved at the mail carrier and who didn't feel the need to explain what she used to do for a living. I liked it that way. I liked that nobody looked at me twice. The house next door belonged to Richard Coleman, a real estate developer who'd built half the shopping centers on the east side of the county and never let anyone forget it. He drove a white Escalade that he backed into the driveway every single time, engine idling a beat too long, like he wanted the whole block to register his arrival. His son Brandon was 22, home from a semester he dropped out of, and deep into what he called his fight career, amateur MMA. A blue belt turned purple turned black in what felt like record time. Though I never once saw him spar with anyone who could actually hurt him, he had 12,000 followers and a highlight reel set to music that thumped through his open garage every afternoon. I noticed him before he noticed me. That's usually how it goes with men like Brandon. They're so busy being watched that they don't watch back. He revved his motorcycle at 6 o'clock in the morning right under my bedroom window, 3 days in a row before I even said a word. He took up 2 parking spots outside the community mailbox, like it was his personal reserved lot. I watched him once from my porch shoulder check a delivery driver half his size, just because the man's cart was blocking the sidewalk for 4 seconds too long. Nobody said anything. That's the thing about neighborhoods like Cedar Ridge. Everyone's polite until the moment politeness costs them something, and then the silence gets very loud. I started running every morning at 5:30 before the sun cracked over the ridge, because that's when the world still belonged to me and nobody else. Old habit in the regiment. 5:30 was already late. Brandon caught me one morning jogging past his driveway in a faded gray t-shirt and running shorts, and he said something to his buddy loud enough that he clearly wanted me to hear it. "She doesn't even look like she could survive one round." His friend laughed. I didn't break stride. I didn't turn my head. There's a particular kind of restraint you learn in this life. The kind that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with knowing exactly what you're capable of and choosing deliberately not to prove it to strangers. I smiled instead. Not for him, not really. For myself. Because if he'd known even a fraction of what I'd walked through, he would have swallowed those words before they ever left his mouth. I want to be honest about something. Part of me understood him. I'd seen young men like Brandon before, plenty of them, before the army got hold of them and reshaped what they thought strength meant. Boys raised on money and mirrors who confuse aggression with confidence because nobody ever taught them the difference. In another life under different discipline, Brandon might have made a decent soldier. He had the aggression, he just didn't have the humility, and nobody in his life seemed interested in teaching it to him. His father certainly wasn't going to. Richard Coleman treated the neighborhood like an extension of his portfolio, something to be managed, curated, and occasionally reminded of who was really in charge. He was cordial to my face in that specific way. Wealthy men are cordial to people they've already decided. Don't matter a firm handshake, a joke about the housing market, eyes already moving past me before I finished my sentence. I didn't take it personally. I'd met 100 versions of Richard in my life. Men who mistook their bank account for a chain of command. What I didn't expect, what I genuinely didn't see coming that first month, was how quickly Brandon's attention would drift from me to my son. Ethan was 15 that summer. Quiet and thoughtful in the way kids get when they've moved around more than most, when they've learned not to get too attached to a school or a street, because the army doesn't ask permission before it reassigns you. He rode his bike up and down Larkspur Lane, in the evenings headphones in minding his own business. He didn't know anything about combives or command presence. He knew about video games, and a girl in his algebra class, and the new skateboard he was saving up for. He was in every way that mattered still just a boy. I watched Brandon watch him one evening from across the street, that same lazy, entitled smile creeping onto his face. And something in my chest went very still and very sharp the way it used to. Right before a briefing I already knew was going to go badly, I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself boys like Brandon eventually got bored and moved on to easier targets. I was wrong. And it wouldn't take long to find out just how wrong I was. There's a particular kind of dread that only parents understand. The one that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles in slowly, like weather changing on the horizon. You feel it before you can name it. By the second week of July, I felt it every time I heard Brandon's motorcycle idle a little too long near our end of the street. It started small the way these things always do. Brandon would drive slow past the cul-de-sac, where Ethan and a couple of the neighborhood kids played basketball, revving his engine just enough to scatter them off the asphalt. He'd park his truck sideways across the makeshift court they'd claimed at the end of the block, forcing them to relocate. Yield, and he'd sit there in the driver's seat, scrolling his phone, pretending not to notice the game he'd just ended. Once, twice, I could chalk up to carelessness. By the fourth time, I understood it wasn't carelessness at all. It was a message. This street, this space belonged to him, and everyone else existed on his terms. Then it got personal. I came home from a long day of video conference with Army Futures Command that ran 2 hours over the kind of day that leaves your jaw sore from clenching it, and found Ethan sitting on our front steps, quiet in a way that immediately put me on alert. He wasn't crying. My son doesn't cry easily. Hasn't since he was maybe 9. But there's a stillness he gets when something's eating at him. A stillness I recognized because I'd seen it in young soldiers after their first hard lesson about the world. "Everything okay?" I asked, setting my bag down slow, giving him room. He shrugged. "Brandon called me Mommy's little soldier in front of everyone at the court today. Said it like a joke." Everybody laughed. I felt something tight and low in my stomach, an old and familiar heat I hadn't felt in years. Not since the last time I'd watched someone underestimate the people under my command and pay for it. But I kept my voice level, because that's the job. That's always been the job. Not the absence of anger, but the discipline to not let it drive. "What did you say back?" I asked. "Nothing." What was I supposed to say? I sat down next to him on the step close enough that our shoulders touched. "Nothing tonight." That's the right answer. "Ethan, listen to me. Don't fight people who are desperate to prove something. That kind of hunger, it's bottomless. You can't satisfy it by giving him a reaction, you just feed it." He nodded, but I could tell the words didn't land the way I wanted them to. 15-year-olds don't run on wisdom. They run on humiliation and the desperate need to undo it. I understood that. I'd been 15 once too, though it felt like a different woman's life by now. I hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 10 days later, on a warm Saturday afternoon that should have been unremarkable, I was inside prepping dinner when I heard raised voices outside Brandon's laugh, cutting through the open kitchen window, sharp and performative. I stepped onto the porch and found Ethan standing over his bike, which was on its side in the middle of the street front wheel, still spinning chain half off the sprocket. Brandon stood a few feet away with his phone raised, filming, grinning at the screen like he was building toward a punchline. "Say it again." Brandon was saying clearly to the camera and not to Ethan, "Say what you called me." Ethan's face was red, jaw tight, hands curled at his sides in that helpless, furious way kids get when they're outmatched and know it. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I walked the same measured pace I'd use approaching a situation that needed control, not chaos. Because chaos is exactly what an aggressor wants from you. It confirms they've gotten under your skin. "Pick up the bike," I said, not loud. I didn't need loud. Brandon lowered the phone just enough to look at me, that same lazy smirk still hanging off his face. Or what? I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him. "Really?" Look the way you look at a threat assessment cataloging, without judgment. Without heat, just information mile. His stance was loose, weight forward, the posture of someone used to being the most dangerous person in any room he walked into. His eyes, though, flickered for half a second under my gaze. Something involuntary and small, a flash of uncertainty. He probably didn't even register himself. I've seen that flicker in men, 3 times his size, right before they decide it's smarter to back down than to test the thing standing in front of them. For a moment, I thought he might actually pick up the bike. That's when Richard's Escalade pulled into the driveway, and he stepped out mid-phone call, taking in the scene with the mild irritation of a man interrupted during something important. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask if Ethan was okay. He looked at me standing on the street in my gardening clothes, dirt still on my knees from the flower bed I'd been working, and something about my stillness seemed to amuse him. "You military people," he said, finishing his call and slipping the phone into his blazer pocket. "Always think rank matters outside the base." I could have said a dozen things in that moment. I could have told him exactly what rank had taught me. Exactly what it meant to hold the line when everyone around you wanted to break formation. Exactly how many young men and women I'd watched grow into people far better than the boy currently filming my son's humiliation for likes. Instead, I said nothing. I picked up Ethan's bike myself, set it upright, and walked it back toward our garage while my son trailed behind me, confused and a little embarrassed by my silence. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked once we were inside, voice cracking with something between frustration and disappointment. "Because he wanted a reaction," I told him, setting the bike against the wall. "And I don't hand out what people want from me just because they're loud enough to demand it." But that night, lying awake long after Ethan had gone to bed, I felt the old current stirring underneath my calm. The same current I used to feel the night before an operation when stillness on the surface meant something entirely different was moving underneath. I understood with total clarity that this wasn't over. Boys like Brandon didn't stop because you walked away. They stopped when the world finally showed them undeniably that walking away had never once been the same thing as being afraid. I just didn't know yet how public that lesson was about to become. Labor Day in Cedar Ridge was an institution. Every year the HOA closed off half of Larker Lane. Folding tables went up under string lights. Someone's smoker filled the whole Koldak with the smell of brisket by noon, and every family on the street showed up whether they liked their neighbors or not. It was the one day a year the entire community occupied the same square of pavement, and by 4 in the afternoon that square of pavement was packed. I almost didn't go. I'd had a rough week, a budget review that ran long, a phone call with a general who liked to hear himself talk, the low hum of exhaustion that never fully leaves you no matter how many years you've been doing the job. But Ethan wanted to go. Wanted a normal afternoon with normal neighborhood kids doing normal neighborhood things, and after the summer he'd had, I wasn't about to deny him that. We arrived a little after 3. I wore jeans and an old gray Henley hair pulled back, nothing that would draw a second look. That was always the point. I brought a bowl of pasta salad, because that's what you bring to these things. And I found a spot near the Hendersons' driveway where I could keep half an eye on Ethan while he threw a football around with a couple of boys his age. Brandon showed up around 4 already. A few beers in, moving through the crowd with the loose, expansive energy of someone who knew he was the most physically imposing person at the party, and had decided that fact entitled him to the floor. He'd brought his fight highlight reel up on somebody's phone at one point, narrating his own knockouts like a sports announcer, and the small cluster of people around him laughed at all the right moments. The way people laugh when they're humoring someone, rather than genuinely entertained. I watched it from a distance, sipping lemonade, saying nothing, wanting nothing more than to get through the afternoon without incident. Around 5, the sun dipping low enough to turn everything gold. Brandon's voice rose above the general chatter of the party, that particular pitchmen get when they've had just enough alcohol to mistake volume for charisma. "Anybody here think they can beat me?" he called out, arms spread, grinning at the crowd like he already knew the answer. "Come on, anybody. I'll go easy." Nobody answered, a few uncomfortable laughs. Somebody's dad shook his head and turned back to the grill. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was the silence of people who found him exhausting, but didn't want the confrontation of saying so out loud. That silence seemed to bother Brandon more than an outright challenge would have. He scanned the crowd, and I felt it before I saw it. The exact moment his eyes landed on me, standing near the drink table with my lemonade, unremarkable, unbothered. "What about you, Colonel?" he said, and the crowd's attention shifted toward me like a tide changing direction. He'd taken to calling me that as a joke months ago, a mocking little nickname, because Ethan had let it slip once that I served, and Brandon had decided it was funny, a woman with a rank nobody in the neighborhood took seriously. "You're always so quiet, so calm. I bet you think you could take me." I didn't answer. I took a sip of my lemonade. He crossed the pavement toward me, unzipping the small gym bag he'd apparently brought for exactly this moment, and pulled out a pair of MMA gloves, red and worn from use, and dropped them at my feet. They hit the concrete with a soft thud that somehow silenced the entire block. String lights swayed overhead. Someone's phone came up already filming. I felt every eye on that street turn toward us at once. "Come on, Colonel," Brandon said loud enough for everyone to hear, that same performative grin plastered across his face. "Put your money where your mouth is." "I haven't said a word," I said quietly. "Exactly," he shot back, playing to the crowd now, feeding off the attention. "You never do. You just walk around here acting like you're better than everybody, like you know something the rest of us don't. So, show us. Or is the tough guy act just for civilians who don't know any better?" I felt Ethan's eyes on me from across the yard, frozen mid-throw football forgotten in his hands. I felt Richard's presence too, drifting closer with his phone already raised. That same amused superiority on his face, the look of a man who fully expected this to end in his son's favor, and wanted documentation of it. I looked down at the gloves, then back up at Brandon. "Are you sure?" I asked him, calm, even the exact tone I'd have used briefing a room full of colonels twice his age about an operation that carried real risk. Something flickered across his face. That same half-second hesitation I'd caught weeks earlier in the street, quickly buried under bravado. "Scared," he said louder now for the crowd. I reached up and unclasped my watch, handing it without a word to Mrs. Henderson standing nearby, who took it with wide eyes and an somewhere between alarm and disbelief. I walked to where Ethan stood, took my phone from my pocket and handed it to him. "Stand behind the fence." I told him quiet enough that it was just between us. "Whatever happens, stay there." He looked at me like he wanted to ask 100 questions at once, but something in my face must have told him this wasn't the moment. He nodded and backed toward the fence-line phone, clutched in both hands, eyes wide. The crowd had gone fully silent now, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your ears. Somebody turned off the music that had been playing from a speaker on someone's porch. Richard stood near the front of the gathered onlookers' phone, raised, filming his son's opponent with the confident ease of a man who had already decided how this story would end. Real. I stepped out of my sandals and onto the warm pavement in bare feet. The September sun sitting low and orange over the rooftops of Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across a street that was about to learn something about the woman who lived at the end of it. Brandon rolled his neck, bounced once on the balls of his feet, and slid his hands into the gloves he'd have no time to actually use. I didn't put on gloves. I didn't need them. "Whenever you're ready," I said. The whole block held its breath. Brandon came at me exactly the way I expected him to. Cage fighters, even amateur ones, are trained to close distance fast, to use aggression as a weapon before technique even enters the equation. He lunged forward, with a looping right hand more show than substance. The kind of strike designed to look devastating on a highlight reel, rather than actually land clean on someone who knew what they were doing. I'd seen that exact shape of aggression 1,000 times before in training rooms, and in places far less forgiving than a suburban cul-de-sac with string lights overhead. I didn't throw a single punch back. Not one. Not for the entire fight. That decision wasn't mercy. Not yet. It was strategy. A man who's used to being the most dangerous person in the room reads a counterpunch as confirmation that he's in a fight worth having. I wasn't interested in confirming anything for Brandon. I was interested in ending this as quickly and as cleanly as possible. I slipped his first strike with a small pivot of my hips, barely more than a shift in weight, and his momentum carried him half a step past me. The crowd made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a murmur, the specific noise people make when their expectations get quietly rearranged. Brandon recovered fast. I'll give him that. He had genuine athleticism buried under all that bravado, and spun back toward me with a low kick aimed at my thigh. I stepped inside it, instead of away, closing the distance he desperately wanted to control, and caught his extended arm in an arm drag that used his own forward momentum against him. It's a simple technique. Old as grappling itself, but simple only works if your timing is exact. And 20 years of training had given me nothing, if not exact timing. He stumbled forward off balance, and before he could reset his stance, I had my hip against his one arm, hooked around his waist in a body lock that took away everything he needed. Space leverage, the ability to generate power in any strike. He tried to muscle out of it. Brandon was strong, genuinely strong, the kind of gym-built strength that looks impressive under fluorescent lighting and video filters. But strength without structure just spits itself out fast. And I felt the exact moment his breathing changed. The exact moment his shoulders started working harder than they needed to, because his technique had abandoned him under pressure. I swept his lead foot clean and simple, and put him on the ground. The crowd's murmur sharpened into something closer to shock. Brandon scrambled back up almost immediately, jaw tight now, all the performance drained out of his face, and replaced with something raw, something closer to the truth of what was actually happening. He came at me again, faster this time, more desperate, throwing a combination that had real intent behind it. I felt the first punch graze past my ear close enough that the air moved, and something in my chest went cold and sharp and entirely, completely calm. The exact stillness I used to feel in the seconds before a breach, when your body knows exactly what it's built to do and simply does it. I stepped behind him. It happened fast enough that I doubt more than a handful of people in that crowd actually saw the mechanics of it. A rear clinch, hips dropping low. A trip that took his base out from under him before he even registered I'd moved. He hit the pavement hard, the wind audibly leaving him, and I was down with him before he could scramble away. Weight settled across his back, controlling the fight from a position he had absolutely no training to escape from. Every grappling exchange from that point forward was a foregone conclusion. He knew it. I could feel him know it in the way his struggling shifted from strategic to purely instinctive, the flailing of someone who understood, on some animal level, that he was no longer the one in control of what happened to his body. I secured his shoulder, isolated the arm, and locked it in place with the kind of control that made further struggle not just useless, but genuinely dangerous for him if he kept fighting it. Then I shifted to his neck. A controlled hold, nothing designed to hurt, only to communicate with total clarity that this was finished whenever I decided it was finished. I never threw a single punch, not once the entire fight. I want that understood clearly, because it mattered to me in that moment, and to everyone watching. This was never about hurting him. It was about ending something he'd started and refused over and over again to end himself. He tapped my forearm twice fast, the universal signal, breath ragged and desperate beneath me. I released him instantly. No hesitation, no lingering, no extra second held just to make a point. The moment he tapped, it was over completely the way it should always be. I got to my feet first and extended a hand down to him, and after a long beat, pride visibly wearing with exhaustion on his face, he took it, and I pulled him up. The whole street was silent. Not a single phone lowered, not a single word spoken. 75 seconds by the timestamp on somebody's video that circulated later, though it felt both shorter and infinitely longer while it was happening. Brandon stood there in the fading gold light chest, heaving gloves, still on hands that had never once landed a real strike, staring at me like he was seeing an entirely different person than the woman he'd mocked for months. I leaned in close enough that only he could hear me. Winning isn't the same as humiliating someone. I said, I want you to remember that I had 100 chances to hurt you tonight, and I didn't take a single one. That was a choice. I need you to understand it was a choice. He didn't say anything back. He just nodded, once something in his face cracking open in a way that had nothing to do with the fight itself. I turned and looked for Ethan behind the fence and found him standing frozen, my phone forgotten in his hand, eyes wide with something I hadn't seen on his face in a very long time. Not fear, not shock exactly, but a kind of dawning recognition, like a puzzle piece finally sliding into place. I walked to him, put my hand on his shoulder, and said quietly, "Let's go home. Behind us." I heard Richard's voice cut through the silence. sharp and furious, already reaching for his phone with a different purpose. Now that's assault. He was shouting to no one in particular, to everyone at once. Somebody call the police. She assaulted my son. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I already knew exactly how this was going to end, and it wasn't going to end the way Richard Coleman thought it would. The police arrived within 20 minutes. 2 cruisers, pulling up quietly at the edge of the cul-de-sac, while half the neighborhood still stood frozen in the deepening dusk plates of half-eaten barbecue forgotten on folding tables. Richard had called it in himself, breathless and indignant, using words like assault and unprovoked attack before the officers had even stepped out of their vehicles. I stood with Ethan near our driveway, arms crossed, loosely waiting, because I've learned that the worst thing you can do in a moment like that is act like you have something to hide. The younger of the 2 officers approached me first, notepad already out, and asked what happened. I told him plainly. Brandon had challenged me, publicly thrown gloves at my feet, in front of dozens of witnesses, and I'd accepted a fight he initiated on his terms, using techniques designed to control and end the encounter without causing harm. I told him I never struck him once, not a single punch. He looked skeptical. Understandably, that's not usually how these stories go. But then people started coming forward, unprompted, phones already in hand. Mrs. Henderson, still holding my watch, played her video without being asked. The Delgado from 3 houses down had a clearer angle, catching the entire exchange from the moment the gloves hit the ground. A teenager who'd been filming for his own social media account had 11 seconds of Brandon shouting, "Put your money where your mouth is," in crisp, unmistakable audio. By the time 4 different videos had been reviewed on the spot, the picture was undeniable. I hadn't attacked anyone. I'd been baited into a fight I tried repeatedly to avoid, and I'd ended it without ever raising a fist. No charges were filed that night. The older officer, a heavy-set man with kind, tired eyes, actually pulled me aside as he was leaving, and said low enough that only I could hear, "For what it's worth, ma'am." That was about as clean as I've ever seen someone handle a situation like that. I thanked him and didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else that needed saying. Richard, for his part, did not let it go. Not that night, not that week, not that month. I understood somewhere in the weeks that followed that men like Richard Coleman don't experience public humiliation the way most people do. It doesn't register as embarrassment to be absorbed and moved past. It registers as a debt that must be collected, a wound that demands repayment, and he apparently decided very quickly that if the legal system wasn't going to hand him satisfaction, he'd manufacture it some other way. He hired a private investigator. I found this out secondhand through a neighbor who worked at the same law firm the investigator used to source records, a woman named Diane, who felt enough discomfort about the whole situation to give me a quiet heads-up over the fence one afternoon. Richard wanted everything: my employment history, my financial records, anything that might give him leverage to make my life difficult in ways that had nothing to do with what had actually happened at that party. What the investigation turned up instead was the truth about who I actually was. 22 years of service, multiple deployments, command experience in the 75th Ranger Regiment that most civilians, even well-connected ones like Richard, had no real frame of reference for understanding. Decorations he'd never heard of and couldn't properly research the significance of. A current posting at Army Futures Command that put me in rooms with people whose names occasionally made it into defense industry newsletters. Richard actually subscribed to, though he'd apparently never made the connection between those names and his quiet neighbor with the dented pickup truck. I found out later through Diane again that this revelation didn't discourage him. If anything, it seemed to embolden him, further feeding some belief that a woman with that kind of career had powerful people to answer to, people who might be persuaded that she'd embarrassed the Army by brawling with a civilian at a neighborhood barbecue. He began drafting letters, formal ones, on his company, letterhead addressed to the Department of Defense, alleging conduct unbecoming, demanding an official inquiry into my actions. I learned about the letters before they were even sent, because Richard in his confidence mentioned it to another neighbor at the mailbox. Clearly hoping word would spread and reach me, hoping the mere threat would be enough to make me anxious, apologetic, smaller. He wanted to see me sweat. He wanted, I think, some visible confirmation that he still held power over the situation, power he'd felt slipping away from him ever since his son tapped out on his own front lawn in front of the whole block. I didn't sweat. I want to be honest about that. Not out of arrogance, but because I understood something Richard fundamentally didn't. I hadn't done anything wrong. I defended myself. I defended my dignity, and I'd done it with more restraint than most people would have managed under the circumstances. There was no version of an honest inquiry that ended badly for me. The only real question was what an inquiry into Richard's motivations might turn up. Instead, a question I hadn't even thought to ask yet, but one that the universe, or something very close to it, was already quietly answering. Ethan asked me one night sitting at the kitchen table over dinner whether I was worried. I remember exactly what I told him, because I meant every word of it. Worry is for situations you don't understand, I said. I understand this one completely. Richard is a man who has never once in his entire life faced consequences for the way he treats people who don't have his money. He genuinely believes that will hold true forever. I've watched men like that before. Ethan, it never holds true forever. He didn't look entirely convinced. He was 15 and 15 doesn't yet believe that patience is its own kind of weapon. But he trusted me enough to let it go, to finish his dinner, to go back to being a kid worried about algebra tests instead of federal complaints. I trusted something else entirely. Something I'd learned a long time ago in far harder circumstances than this one. When you build your entire life on cutting corners, on leaning on money and influence instead of integrity, that foundation eventually cracks under its own weight. You don't need to push it. You just need to wait and let the structure do what unstable structures always eventually do. I didn't know yet how quickly or how completely that structure was about to come down, but I had a feeling. And in my experience, feelings like that are rarely wrong. The letter landed on the desk of Lieutenant General Michael Donovan on a Tuesday morning, in late September, tucked into a stack of routine correspondence his aide had already flagged for review. I only know the specifics of what happened next, because Michael told me himself, weeks later over a phone call that started serious and ended with both of us laughing harder than either of us had in months. Michael and I went back a long way. We'd served together early in my career before he climbed into the rarefied air of 3-star command, and I settled into the work I do now at Futures Command. He wasn't just a colleague. He was one of the handful of people who'd watched me grow from a green second lieutenant into someone who could hold a room of colonels, silent with a single sentence. And he had over the years developed what I can only describe as a very specific, very dry sense of humor about anyone foolish enough to underestimate me. He told me later that he read the first paragraph of Richard's letter, an aggrieved account of conduct unbecoming an officer, involving an unprovoked physical assault at a private social gathering, and had to set it down for a moment because he was laughing too hard to keep reading. Ashley Parker. He told me he'd said out loud to an empty office, got challenged to a fight, and this man is mad she won. But amusement is not the same as dismissal, and Michael, whatever else he is, has always been thorough. An inquiry was opened exactly as Richard had hoped it would be. Statements were requested, video evidence of which there was an abundance, given how many phones had been recording that Labor Day evening was reviewed in full. Within days, it was clear, beyond any reasonable dispute, that I had done nothing except respond with considerable restraint to a challenge that had been thrown at my feet in front of dozens of witnesses. The inquiry into my conduct closed almost as quickly as it opened, with a formal note in the record, commending clear's throat the composure I'd shown under public provocation. But inquiries once opened have a way of generating their own momentum, and somewhere in the process of verifying the basic facts of the incident, someone on Michael's staff pulled Richard Coleman's business background as a matter of due diligence standard procedure. When a formal complaint involves a private citizen making serious allegations against a serving officer, What they found had nothing to do with me at all, and everything to do with the very foundation Richard Coleman had built his comfortable life upon. Richard's real estate development firm had, for years, been bidding on municipal contracts, including several tied to public infrastructure projects that received partial federal funding. That connection, thin as it might have seemed, was enough to draw the attention of people whose job it is to notice when federal money intersects with irregularities. And once they started looking, they found quite a lot. Falsified bid documentation on at least 3 contracts. A network of shell subsidiaries that existed as far as anyone could determine for no purpose, other than allowing Richard's firm to sidestep local minority contractor requirements while appearing to comply with them on paper. Payments to a county zoning official that once traced through several intermediary accounts looked far less like consulting fees and far more like what they actually were. I want to be clear about something because it matters to me that this story is told honestly. I did not orchestrate this. I made no calls, wrote no letters, pulled no strings. I have never in my entire career used my position to settle a personal grievance. And I wasn't about to start over a neighborhood dispute involving a man who threw gloves at my feet at a barbecue. What happened to Richard Coleman happened because Richard Coleman built his empire on a foundation of dishonesty, and he made the singular catastrophic error of inviting official scrutiny into his own life at the exact moment that scrutiny was primed to look closely at everyone involved. The Defense Contract Audit Agency got involved, first given the federal funding tied to some of his projects. Then the FBI once the zoning payments surfaced clean enough to warrant a proper investigation. The IRS followed, not long after once his shell company structure came under examination and raised the kinds of red flags that auditors dream about. Within 6 weeks of sending a letter meant to destroy my career, Richard Coleman found himself the subject of 3 separate federal inquiries, his development contracts frozen, pending review, tens of millions of dollars in projects suspended indefinitely. I heard about all of it in pieces the way you hear about a house, collapsing from 2 streets over the sounds. We first, then the dust, then eventually the full shape of what happened. Diane, my neighbor with connections at the law firm, kept me loosely updated always, with the same note of disbelief in her voice. He did this to himself, she said to me once, almost in wonder. He had a legitimate business. He didn't need to cut those corners. He just couldn't help it. Brandon's world came apart on a parallel smaller track, the gym where he trained, sensing the shift in his father's reputation, and unwilling to be associated with either the viral video of his defeat or the mounting federal scrutiny surrounding his family, quietly suspended his membership, citing conduct concerns related to the Labor Day incident, which had by then been viewed close to 2 million times across various platforms, his sponsors, a regional supplement company, and a local gym apparel brand. Both issued polite, carefully worded statements, distancing themselves from him within the same week. The highlight reels stopped. The captions stopped. For the first time since I'd moved to Cedar Ridge, Brandon's garage stayed quiet in the mornings. I felt something complicated watching all of this unfold. Something that wasn't triumph, not exactly. I'd spent my whole career believing that consequences, real consequences, tend to find people eventually, without needing anyone to manufacture them. I hadn't wanted this for Richard, not specifically, not with this scale. I'd simply wanted to be left alone to raise my son in peace, to live the quiet life I'd earned after 2 decades of service. But I also understood, watching it happen, that this wasn't really about me at all. It never had been. Richard Coleman's downfall had been built years before I ever moved on to Larkpur Lane. I had simply been the thread that once pulled, unraveled something that had been fraying all along. Ethan asked me one evening in October, watching the news cover a local segment about the fraud investigation, whether I felt bad about it. I thought about that question longer than I expected to. No, I told him finally. I feel bad for anyone who has to watch their family fall apart. That's a hard thing to witness, even when the person falling built the entire collapse themselves. But I don't feel responsible for it, Ethan, and neither should you. We didn't do this. We just stopped absorbing what wasn't ours to carry, and everything else followed its own gravity. By late November, the Coleman house sat with a 4 sign planted crooked in the front lawn. The kind of sign that goes up when a family is selling out of necessity rather than choice. I watched it from my porch some mornings, coffee in hand, and I felt none of the satisfaction I might have expected to feel back in September, when Richard was still filming my fight with his son and shouting about assault to a police officer who clearly wasn't buying it. Watching a family lose their home doesn't feel like victory. It just feels heavy in a different, quieter way than everything that came before it. The bank foreclosed in early December. I found out from Diane, who'd become something like a genuine friend over those months, that Richard's legal fees alone had eaten through whatever cash reserves the family had left once the federal investigations gathered speed, and once his development contracts stayed frozen through the fall building season. The income simply stopped coming in fast enough to cover what he owed. They moved out on a gray Tuesday morning. A moving truck backed into the driveway, where Brandon used to rev his motorcycle at 6:11 a.m. And by that afternoon, the house was empty, and the street was quiet, in a way it hadn't been quiet since before I'd moved in. Nobody threw a party about it. Nobody gathered at the mailbox to gossip with any real relish. Nay, I think in the end most of the neighborhood had simply grown tired of the noise the Colemans brought with them everywhere they went, and their absence felt less like a triumph and more like an exhale, a street finally allowed to settle back into itself. Brandon came to see me the week before they left. I remember being surprised by the knock on my door, surprised further to find him standing there alone. No phone in hand, no audience, nothing performative about the way he stood on my porch, with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, shoulders drawn in a way I'd never seen on him before. He looked younger than 22 in that moment. He looked honestly like a kid who'd finally run out of road. "That, I wanted to say something before we go," he said, not quite meeting my eyes at first. "I've been thinking about it a lot. The fight, everything before it too. The stuff with Ethan's bike, the way I talked to you, all of it." He paused, jaw working like the words were harder to get out than he'd expected. "I should have listened to all of it. You tried to tell me something that day at the party, and I was too busy trying to look tough in front of a camera to actually hear it." I stood in my doorway and looked at him for a long moment. This young man, who'd spent months treating our street like his personal stage, now standing there with something genuinely humbled in his posture. "Beal," I thought about all the ways I could respond, all the things I could have said about accountability, about the family he was leaving behind, about the version of himself he'd have to build from scratch somewhere new. In the end, I kept it simple, because I found that the truest things usually are. "Strength isn't measured by who you can beat," I told him. "It's measured by who you choose not to hurt. You had 100 chances that day to walk away before it ever got to gloves on the ground, and you didn't take a single one of them. That's the lesson here, Brandon, not the fight." "What happened before the fight?" He nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something behind his eyes that looked like it might actually stick. "Can I say sorry to Ethan?" he asked. "Before we go." I called Ethan down from his room, and I watched from the kitchen doorway as the two of them stood on my porch. Brandon apologizing in a voice stripped of all its old bravado. Ethan listening with the particular grace that 15-year-olds sometimes surprise you, with the grace of someone who never needed revenge to feel whole, only acknowledgement. They shook hands. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just two boys in their own way, closing a door that had been open and swinging too long. The Colemans moved 3 states away somewhere Richard apparently had extended family who could offer him a fresh start once the legal dust settled. I heard secondhand that he eventually pled to a reduced set of charges, paid substantial restitution, and lost his contractor's license permanently. I didn't feel the need to follow the story much further than that. Some chapters close on their own, and you don't need to read every page to understand how the book ends. Cedar Ridge went back to being exactly what the listing had promised me back in June. Quiet, unremarkable, peaceful in the specific way that only comes after storms pass through and clear out. I still run every morning at 5:30. Same gray shirt, same worn-in shoes, same empty street, humming with early light before the rest of the neighborhood wakes up. But something's different now. Something small but real. The neighbors who used to look past me, who never quite registered the woman at the end of the street stop now. They wave. Sometimes they walk out to their mailboxes a little early just to say good morning. And I always say it back, because that's what neighbors do when the noise finally clears enough to hear each other properly. Ethan's doing well. He made varsity soccer that spring, and he doesn't talk about that summer much anymore though. Every once in a while, when someone at school tries to push him around the way Brandon once did, I notice he doesn't flinch the way he used to. He just watches calm, unbothered, the exact stillness I spent 20 years learning myself quietly pass down without either of us ever really discussing it. I think about that whole season often, honestly, not with anger, not anymore, with something closer to gratitude. Strange as that sounds, because it taught me all over again, something I'd already learned once in a much harder place under much harder circumstances. That patience isn't passivity, and walking away isn't weakness. And the people who mistake your restraint for fear are always eventually the ones who learn the hardest lesson of all. Bullies mistake patience for weakness. They never realize that the strongest people are usually the last ones looking for a fight. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where it found you today. Drop a comment below and tell me what part hit hardest. I read every single one. And if you're the kind of person who believes quiet strength always wins in the end, hit subscribe, because we've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you week after week. Let's keep this journey going together.